Hello everyone, welcome to another EU4 Basics guide. Today we will discuss buildings. Sounds kind of boring, right? Just buildings? They take so long to build and cost 100 ducats at start, which isn't really cheap, but it seems like a good idea to just plop down some churches, workshops, marketplaces, and some provinces, and that's what most newer players will do. As buildings seem like a mundane mechanic to think about, but they actually cost a lot of ducats to build, and maybe those ducats could find a better use? Let's see if we can answer the question of how important buildings are and which ones you should prioritize. Now, if you're looking for a set build order, you won't find one in this video, because that would be too easy and EU4 doesn't do easy. Which buildings you build are very much dependent on what kind of game you're playing. Just as EU4 gameplay differs between playing tall, playing wide, starting as a one province miner, or starting as Ottomans, your building priorities will also change with the gameplay. There's a fantastic post on the Paradox forums on this topic, and someone did detailed calculations on it. The post is a couple of years old now, so it might not be accurate, but it still gives you a good idea on how buildings work. I'll leave a link to that post in description, check it out, and thanks Solstice for letting me use that information here. In this video, I will try to minimize using complicated math, and I'll just give my advice on what are the best buildings. So let's start by looking at different building types and try to figure out when they are worth building. Temples or churches are one of the first buildings we can build at Admin Tech 4. They give 40% local tax increase and cost 100 ducats. The 40% local tax increase term is very ambiguous, and I don't know why Paradox doesn't use consistent terms in their tooltips. But that 40% increase applies to the tax income efficiency in this equation, which calculates the provincial tax income. So it's a modifier to that base tax development, taking local autonomy into consideration. And the return of investment on these primary tax buildings is really good. If you make a church or temple in a province with just 3 tax dev, you will get your money back in less than 25 years, which is pretty good compared to other buildings. So my advice is to build churches or temples as early as possible in any provinces that give plus 0.2 ducats a month, which you can see from the builder screen. The Tier 2 tax building is Cathedral, which gives 60% local tax increase, which is again 60% tax income efficiency in the province, and the building costs 300 ducats. So comparing it to a temple, a cathedral costs 3 times the ducats while only giving 50% increase in tax modifier. If that doesn't sound like a good deal to you, you are correct. It is a terrible deal. And that is going to be a problem with every Tier 2 building in EU4. They are usually not worth the price. My rule of thumb with Cathedral is to just never build them. That might sound extreme, but the ROI, the return of investment on cathedrals, is not good enough, especially when you upgrade them from temples. Say you have a huge province with 20 tax development, and if you upgrade your temple in that province to cathedral, the ROI time is actually close to 75 years. And obviously the ROI time goes even higher for lower dev provinces. And since you only unlock Cathedral at Admin Tech 19, that will be around 1650-ish, you just don't have a lot of time left in game to get profit out of it. And if you do have a huge 20 dev tax province, you're better off building something else there as you have limited building slots. Or even just spending those ducats on another province as you have limited ducats as well. Cathedrals do give another useful bonus that is often overlooked, and that's the 3% local missionary strength, which is helpful if you're trying to convert a province such as Rome, which has negative conversion modifiers, or if you're trying to get one faith achievement, you might build cathedrals in some provinces. So my advice is to never build a cathedral unless you're building it for the missionary strength bonus. Next, let's look at trade buildings, because they also unlock early with Marketplace at Diplotech 4. Trade buildings are the only ones that also have a Tier 3 building. Marketplaces or trade buildings in general are probably the most overbuilt buildings in game. I know I have overbuilt these buildings until recently. Marketplaces give 50% local trade power, which sounds good as more provincial trade power will mean more trade power in the trade node and more ducats. But actually, trade buildings are fairly useless because you don't need more trade power in a trade node once you control most of it. It's the same principle as using trade ships. You don't use trade ships in a trade node where you have a lot of trade power. So you might build a marketplace in a province which is in a trade node that isn't controlled by you, and you don't anticipate controlling that trade node in near future. which rarely happens in your usual single player game where most players would play wide and eventually get enough trade power in that node, thus making any trade building useless. You can build it earlier in game to get some trade power and then later replace it with some other building, but the ROI is not justified in that case either. Another use for trade buildings is to build them in trade company regions, so you can get to 51% trade power in that node quicker, which gives an extra merchant. My advice here is to just not build any trade buildings, unless you're going for some trade power related achievement or the trade company scenario I mentioned. Or you have some provinces in a trade node you never want to expand into. As you can see, their use is very situational, and it's weird that the only type of building with tier 3 building is not useful in most cases. Let's move on to production buildings next, as we unlock Workshop at Advantech 6. They give plus 50% local production efficiency, finally some consistency in using the correct term in the tooltip, and they cost 100 ducats. Now let's look at the calculations first. Production income is calculated by production efficiency and trade value. And trade value is calculated by the trade's goods in province and goods produced modifier. And goods produced in turn is dependent on the production value of the province. And you can look at all those equations in the EU4 wiki again. I'm not going to go deep into how income is calculated in this video. So long story short, you want to build production buildings in a high trade goods province with a high production development. Workshops are fairly profitable buildings and actually have a good ROI. My usual strategy with them is the same as temples, as I build workshops when it gives plus 0.2 or more extra income. The tier 2 production building is the counting house that costs 400 ducats and gives 100% local production efficiency. So again, compared to workshops, it's 4 times the price for just twice the production efficiency. Not a good deal, especially when you consider they unlock at Advantech 24, that's almost 1700 or 1720-ish. There's not much of the game left now to justify that cost, and it's very likely that you're swimming in money by now and you don't care for few extra ducats you might make in the last 50 years of game. On the rare occasions that I play the game for that long, I don't build counting houses. So to summarize, workshops are pretty good, not as good as temples, but still they give decent returns. Counting houses are not worth the money. However, workshops are even better with a manufactory. Manufactories cost 500 ducats, so they are a hefty investment, and they give plus 1 goods produced. Straight up plus 1 goods. And you might remember the equation from earlier. Goods produced modifiers affects both trade value and production income. So manufactories give boosts to both trade and production income, which is insanely good. Different manufactories unlock at different tech levels, and these different manufactories are specific to the trade goods present in a province, such as farm state for grains, naval equipment for fish, textile for cloth, and so on. The price of trade goods will determine where you want to prioritize building the manufactories. Although even in provinces with low value trade goods such as grain and livestock, building manufactories will give you a decent ROI. It's a bit harder to calculate how many years it will take for the return, since manufactories also affect trade power. And if you have a basic understanding of trade in EU4, you will know that it's very dynamic and trade income will depend on what your neighboring nations are doing. But regardless, manufactories are amazing. Now, since manufactories give plus 1 goods produced modifier, they also improve production income. And so workshops will produce more money if there is a manufactory in the province. And that again complicates the ROI calculations a bit. But to simplify it, workshops plus manufactory in any province is great, and it scales up significantly with higher value trade goods. The question you should ask is, should you spend 500 ducats in building 1 manufactory, or use those 500 ducats to build 5 workshops? And the answer is complicated because EU4 doesn't do not complicated. For the top trade goods with base value of 4, such as ivory, cocoa, dyes, gems, always build both manufactory and workshop. Always. But you should prioritize building workshops in provinces. Even with trade good of value of 3.5 or 3, for provinces with mid-level production devs, say around 8 or 9, workshops will give better ROI. But for lower dev provinces, manufactories perform better. And if you have some money on hand, you should build manufactories early game, even in low trade goods provinces such as grain, wine, and livestock. The next natural question after this is, what about 1 manufactory versus 5 temples? Which one of those gives better ROI? The answer here is always temples, and temples win again versus workshops too. Temples are the best early ROI buildings in game. you cannot go wrong with building temples. So that section was a bit complicated, and there are a lot more variations depending on which provinces you own and what's the trade situation and other tax and production modifiers. My general advice here is to prioritize workshops in provinces with high trade value goods and high production development, and build manufactories in other provinces. And for all 3.5 and over trade goods, always build manufactory and workshop together. Manufactories are also good as they help spawn the manufacturer's institution, and they will also increase the institution's spread. There is another special manufactory for the trade good of coal, which is the best building in game. It's called a furnace, and it costs the same as any other manufactory at 500 ducats, but it gives 5% global goods produced modifier per furnace, which is insane. As we just saw that goods produced affects both production and trade, so having any modifier to goods produced is going to be very profitable. Furnace only unlocks at Admin Tech 21, but if you have any provinces with coal, build that furnace right away. It might actually be the only building that is worth taking a loan for. Next set of buildings are courthouses and town halls. These lower autonomy faster and reduce state maintenance. They are useless, absolute garbage. There are only two instances that I can think of they might be kind of useful. One, if you just acquired a gold mine, you can build a courthouse or town hall there, which will lower the autonomy faster and thus give you more money quickly. Then you can delete the building once autonomy is at 0, which begs the question, is spending 100 or 200 ducats worth it to lower the autonomy quickly? Probably not. And second case is if you have a state edict permanently active somewhere, such as the trade edict in a state with center of trade, building a courthouse or town hall will help lower the state maintenance cost. But again, building those will be very low on the priority list. There are better things you can spend your money on. So my advice is to never build them. They are a waste of money and building slots. University is another building that is very situational. Universities cost 300 ducats, so they are expensive, and they give minus 20% local dev cost and +1 building slot. They also help with spawning enlightenment institution and its spread. So I do build them in a couple of provinces usually, but that's about it. Their real use is when playing tall, as it helps stack that extra dev cost bonus. Next, let's look at military buildings. There are a lot of them, and they give land and naval force limits and manpowers and sailors. For most single player games, they are not worth the ducats or the building slots. Yes, you can build a shipyard or docks if you have only 1 or 2 coastal provinces and you want to get some sailors and navy going, and the ship repair speed is nice too. But again, if you're playing a wide single player game, these buildings will become obsolete pretty quickly, and you will likely replace them with some other buildings very soon. Same goes with manpower buildings. It might seem like having more manpower is a good thing, and it is, manpower is super important, but rather than spending ducats to build a building that gives you manpower, you can just spend those ducats to hire mercenaries, which would prove to be more cost effective when used properly. I personally tend to never build any military buildings in my game, although they are very helpful in both multiplayer games and when playing tall. Forts are other buildings that are fairly important and only buildings that have maintenance costs. They are very positionally dependent though. You want to build them in mountains and highlands where you are expecting your enemy to engage. Another perk forts give is army tradition. You earn +1 army tradition that scales with every active fort per 50 development of your nation. That means you take your total dev divided by 50 and you get the number of active forts you need to get the +1 army tradition. Army tradition is a really strong mechanic, and I always try to maximize it in my games. There is one catch here though. This bonus only applies to forts in the current technology. There are 4 levels of forts, and you get level 4 forts at Military Tech 14. Once you hit Military Tech 14, all level 2 forts are now considered obsolete, and thus they don't produce any army tradition. And I think this was going to get fixed earlier, but I'm pretty sure it's still the case. Let me know in comments if I'm wrong here, but I think I'm right that at Tech 14 you need to upgrade all forts to level 4 to get that army tradition bonus. And these level 4 forts cost 2 ducats a month to maintain, which is a lot. So forts are useful, yes. Especially early to mid game, you want to have many forts, but once you hit Military Tech 14, having many forts is not that valuable, as they become either obsolete or too expensive. They are again super helpful in multiplayer games or when playing tall. And those are all the buildings you will have in a normal game. There are some native buildings that are unique to natives, but we are not going to get deep into that. I will leave a link to the wiki page just in case you want to read about them, and we might discuss them when I do a guide on playing as natives. So final verdict, temples are awesome. Prioritize building them everywhere that gives plus 0.2 ducats to start with, and even build at plus 0.15 ducats when you have the money to spare. Workshops are awesome too, build them in high production dev provinces. Manufactories are amazing, especially in high trade value provinces and when combined with workshops. Furnace is the mother of all buildings and build it everywhere you can. And all other buildings are very situational, and you might be better off spending that money somewhere else. Now these general considerations obviously change when playing tall or in multiplayer games. But here's the million-dollar question. Should you spend all those ducats in buildings or instead just buy mercenaries? Because with mercs you can win wars and gain more provinces and get more money that way. So maybe mercs are actually most cost efficient to buy than any buildings you can build. That might be dependent on your playstyle, but it is something to ponder. And with that thought, I will conclude this short basics guide on buildings. I hope it helps newer players in deciding how to spend those hard-earned ducats. Let me know in comments if you have a cool strategy for buildings. You are watching a Radio Res guide. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you all in the next one.